Welcome back to the Hoopball YouTube channel. My name is Alan Sroki, and today we're going to be breaking down some big the league earlier this week. John Wall and the Houston Rockets have mutually agreed to part ways for the 2021-2022 NBA season. News that's not necessarily surprising in the grand scheme of things, but it was a little unexpected to have received this news when we did. I think a lot of us were anticipating that John Wall would at least start the season with the Rockets as their starting point guard, perhaps play throughout midway through the year. Maybe they rest him like we've seen with other vets on other teams at different points of this. They have determined that there's just no path forward for these two to just continue working together. And it makes sense with John Wall at this stage of his career, probably looking to hop on to a contender, play meaningful basketball while he is still able to be healthy. And then for the Rockets, they have a bevy of talented young guards that they give opportunities that were being occupied by Wall in the high usage role that we saw him in this last season. All things considered, it appears to be an amenable separation between the two sides. I don't really see how it evolves soon. The Rockets have said they're going to explore finding a trade for Wall. I frankly just don't see one on the horizon, given the size of his contract, about 2 years, $88 million remaining on that deal. Not a lot of teams that can just take that on. He's still a productive player, but it might behoove him to take a gap this season, get his body right. Only 1 year left on that deal, a lot easier for a team to stomach and take him on. So at the moment, I think it's fair to assume that John Wall is just not going to play, if not for most of the season, maybe not any of this upcoming season, which obviously takes him off of any draft board that he might have been on for any weeks. But Wall is not the player I'm interested in talking about in today's video. I think that there's a huge amount of fantasy ramifications that are going to come out of Wall not being in Houston, obviously. And we're just going to break down some of the key players that I think stand to benefit from this upcoming move and what that means for fantasy drafts that will come down in the next few weeks as the season gets closer and closer. Before we dive in, of course, this is a Hoopball presentation. Hoopball.com is where you get fantasy good content that we produce up there. This is your first time visiting the channel. Please drop a like on the video, subscribe if you appreciate content like this, want to see videos similar to this, and you know what? We will do our best to oblige. We've got a lot of stuff cooking up here at Hoopball that we're going to be releasing over the next several weeks in the lead up to drafts, help you dominate your leagues and just be ahead of the curve in terms of what to expect for this season. And with that, let's just get right to that stuff. And let's start by looking at what John Wall did as a Houston Rocket during the 2020-2021 season. These are his numbers for his debut season with the Rockets: 20 points per game, 7 assists, about 40% shooting from the floor, 3.5 turnovers, 32 minutes per game. Not pretty par of the course for a John Wall season. I mean, there was definitely a ton of rust that he worked through working his way back from the injury that kept him out for a year and a half up until this season. But really, the big numbers that pop out when you look at what he did that year is the sky-high usage rate of about 32%. That's among the highest in all of the NBA. 18 shots per game is also quite high in terms of just where players end up shaking out. And it's just evidence of a veteran player stepping into a situation where not only he was the best guy or had the highest pedigree, but there's just a ton of inexperience on this team. And with the ball in his hands, it made it pretty easy for him to command just an absolute ton of usage. And now that's all gone. It's all up for grabs. 32 point guard minutes, 18 shots. There is a lot to be absorbed here. And you're probably thinking, well, Alan, there's a pretty logical candidate to absorb a lot of those shot attempts. His name's Jalen Green. You might have heard of him. Second overall pick in the NBA draft. Probably going to be leading this team in shot attempts this year. And I'd tell you, correct. That is where a lot of these shots are probably going to wind up going. Jalen Green is going to be someone who the Rockets just have a lot of invest in already. They view him as a face of the franchise caliber player, someone they could build an entire offense around. And I have no doubt that if he's not the top shot taker on this team next year, he's definitely going to be top 2. But, Portuguese is a very difficult game. We don't have enough data to know for certain one way or another, how much he's going to shoot and how much he's going to play. I mean, we can just say a lot and leave it at that. We'll probably be right. Instead, I'd rather focus on some of the players that they already have in-house from last year, who we actually got to see step into larger roles during the games that John Wall missed. Wall, he played 40 games, missed 32 of them. We have an idea of where that usage gets spaced around when he's not out there. And I think that there are two players in particular that, are really going to see an uptick in production as a result of him there that we were able to see last year. Those two players, of course, are Kevin Porter Jr. and Sean Tate. These two are two of the younger wings that are on that the Rockets have at their disposal. Kevin Porter Jr. in particular is going to be someone who I think most people will point to as being the main beneficiary of John Wall no longer being in Houston. We saw after he joined the Rockets on March 11th last season, Kevin Porter Jr. played a considerable amount of point guard for that team, especially in the games that Wall missed. League as a wing, himself as more of a point guard, and he was able to showcase that as a member of the Rockets. He averaged over 6 assists per game. A lot of those coming during those stints of playing backup point guard minutes and starting point guard minutes when John Wall was sitting games. And I'm pretty confident, I'd say 99.9% confident that he's going to be their starting point guard this season in Houston. He's probably going to absorb all 32 of those point guard minutes, and it's quite possible that he plays, if not all, a large amount of his minutes, almost the vast majority of his minutes at point guard this year. And you have to just look at the depth chart to just confirm it for you. There are very few options at the point on this team outside KPJ. Augustin on the team, a traditional point guard, journeyman, backup veteran. You can probably command some playing time, but he's certainly not a starter. Armani Brooks is on an Exhibit 10 deal, and he got some opportunities with Houston last year. By no stretch does that mean that he is ready to be their starting point guard. It's going to be Kevin Porter Jr., and that's pretty big for him. That is going in terms of production in fantasy. If you have the ball in your hands most possessions, you're going to have higher usage, and you're going to have more opportunities to produce. That is, and now with Wall out of the way, when I was projecting what the starting lineup for Houston would look like this year, and when I assumed that Wall would be their point guard, I had Kevin Porter Jr. slotted in as a shooting guard, small forward, one of those two roles next to Jalen Green in that unit. Now that he slots up to point guard, that creates another hole in the starting lineup, and I believe that Sean Tate will take that starting small forward spot. He will be the guy who will ascend into that lineup, play about 30 minutes per game, and I think that he'll be a very important part of what Houston does this year. Undrafted rookie, first all-team rookie last season, a defensive stalwart, very versatile guy. He has proven himself to be not only a good perimeter defender, but capable as a small ball four. He is a decent facilitator. He can stretch the floor a little bit. He really can he's a multifaceted player. It's the exact type of player that Houston's going to need in this lineups that's going to feature these heavily offensive-oriented Kevin Porter, like Jalen Green and like Christian Wood. You need that defense in there to really mix it up and add some balance to that unit. And I think that alone will give him a pathway to playing near 30 minutes per game. And we saw him produce in that amount of time last year. So I think these two are the beneficiaries of this of Wall's absence. But I want to dig a little deeper. I mean, what does that mean for your drafts? Does that mean that you take these guys in the top 70? Well, let's pump the brakes there a little bit. Because we got to see all these missed games from Wall last year, we actually have a somewhat decent sample size. And I say somewhat there because it's not like, we're not talking about a full season's worth of games. But there's about 15 to 16 games that John Wall, after Kevin Porter Jr. joined. In those games, I really want to take a look at, because when John Wall sat in those games, Porter Jr. was the point guard. Sean Tate was starting. I think that'll give us a decent glimpse to expect heading into this year. Maybe we try to project what kind of fantasy games they're going to have. So let's just take a look at some of those numbers right here. So here, take a look on the left here. These are the games that John Wall missed between March 11th through May 16th. these games, they were not consecutive games, they were disjointed. So I had to go in and sort of calculate these averages for both of these guys. But they're pretty telling on the roles that they took on in Wall's absence. We'll start with Kevin Porter here on the left. 16 games without John Wall. He played 32.8 minutes per game. You'll notice that's pretty close to the start amount of minutes that John Wall averaged as the starting point guard. 19 points per game, 2.3 threes, decent numbers there. 7.5 assists is the key to Porter Jr. right there. That would have been top 10 in the NBA in assists per game had he averaged that out through the course of an entire season. It is those three areas are definitely where people will kind of it's what catches people's eyes. Those are the counting stats that make him an appealing fantasy player. But then you'll take a note down towards the bottom of the screen. These shooting percentages, 43 from the field, 69 from the line. Both of those percentages are on relatively large volume. I believe in these 16 games, Kevin Porter Jr. averaged about 15.5 shots and 4.5 free throws per game. At those percentages, those will ding you up pretty bad in category leagues. The steals and blocks aren't anything to write home about. And then the turnovers per game, 3.7. That would have ranked within the top 5 in the NBA in turnovers on a per game basis had he averaged that out over the course of an entire season. And that really highlights just kind of how raw KPJ is at this position. He's not a point guard by trade. It's sort of something that he is learning on the fly. And he's immensely talented. It's something that I think he is capable of transitioning, a role that he's capable of transitioning to. But I mean, those are really difficult numbers to stomach in a 9-category league setting. So much so that they really do outweigh the positives, like the 19 points and 7.5 assists. They can't counteract the negative tolls that you're going to be taking in those categories down there. On the season, Kevin Porter Jr. was on the season in Houston, he was outside the top 250 in 9-category league settings with those numbers. When you take a look at these right here, if you were to plug them into those same rankings, Porter Jr. would barely get himself to the top 180. And that's really tricky. That's a very tricky road to kind of navigate down, because I think a lot of people see this John Wall news. They know that KPJ is going to be the starting point guard, and that's really going to add to, that's going to throw gasoline onto the fire. There was already a lot of hype around Porter Jr. And I feel like now people are going to start reaching for him in a place where he will just never be able to return value for you. Now, if you're in a points league setting, it's kind of a different story. Depending on how you score different categories and whether or not you take percentages and turnovers into account, Kevin Porter Jr. could be one of the better players in fantasy basketball this year. And that could really influence his rankings in Yahoo and other fantasy sites where he is ranked and where people try and position him. But it's important to remember that, 9-category leagues are, I think a lot of people, maybe the vast majority of fantasy basketball players are playing in those settings. As appealing as these numbers may look, there is a long way for him to go before he's going to return value for you. But I think that this is a fair idea, not necessarily like the exact numbers, but this fantasy stat set that he brings to the table. This is a fair range of expectations for what he will bring as this team's presumptive starting point guard next year. But let's take a look at Sean Tate, who in those exact 16 games, we'll take a look here on the right, about 30 minutes played per game. These numbers here are relatively consistent with what he averaged on the season. The points and three-pointers are a little higher than his season averages of about 11.5 and about 0.9 threes. But everything else is about the same. He averaged 5.3 rebounds on the year. He averaged 2.5 assists, so a little higher assists in these games. And the steals are also relatively high compared to what he did on the year. 1.5 is a pretty lofty number to repeat, but it is evidence of his just immensely talent, his immense talent at that particular skill set, and the biggest source of his fantasy value, as is his field goal percentage. And, this just everything else that he brings to the table there. It's just a nice collection of things that make him a relatively appealing category leagues player. Now, again, I'm not saying that these are the projections that we should anticipate for Sean Tate exactly, but it's a nice framework for the type of numbers that he can produce in this small forward auxiliary role that I believe that he will be playing this year. Before the John Wall news, I think people weren't quite sure where to plug Sean Tate into the equation. Most people weren't sure if he would hit that 30-minute per game mark that he had hit the previous year, that Kevin Porter Jr. and Jalen Green's presence at the wings would really just make it impossible for him. And not to mention, too, Tate played a lot of minutes at power forward last year. And I think that Houston has really gotten a lot better at those forward spots. They have Christian Wood and Daniel Tice. And then you have off the bench Alperen Sengun, Kenyon Martin Jr., Daniel House. Like, there's a lot of guys there who are capable of playing the four. And though Tate does give you somewhat of an advantage by being able to, I think he measures at 6'5", you can play some small ball lineups and he might see at the four this year. But it's not going to be to the degree that he did. The degree that he played the four last year, it will not be the same this season. Per Cleaning the Glass, Tate played at about 44% of Tate's minutes came at the four. I'd anticipate 6 were at small forward. I anticipate that to flip this year, maybe even higher for Tate on the small forward side of things. It might even be a little over 50%, just given the glut of big men that I just went over. But that's not bad for his fantasy value by any stretch. In fact, as a small forward, Tate had a higher steal rate. He had his assist rate position too. I think that he has value in this Houston Rockets lineup as a guy who can do some secondary playmaking. Porter Jr. is not a traditional point guard by any stretch. I think there'll be a lot of facilitating by committee for this Rockets team this year. And Tate is definitely someone who is capable of fitting that mold. So he, two totally different fantasy games here. I think Tate's a much better category leagues player than he would be a points leagues. But I think he might even have value in those types of formats as well. Here's the status of where we're at with him right now. By the way, those numbers that I just had up on the board, that would have made Tate roughly like a 75 player in 9 category leagues. And that's mostly predicated on that really high steals number, which could really fluctuate between 1.2 steals to 1.5. Anywhere in that range could take him down from top 75 to top 100. But if he's playing 30 minutes a game as a starting small forward, I like his chances of getting to that top 100 threshold. Kevin Porter Jr., on the other hand, I'm not quite so sure there's any world that he can get to top 109 category leagues this year. You take a look at their current ADPs on Yahoo. Kevin Porter Jr. is going right around pick 100, which, frankly, that's a great range to take him if you can. Once you get to the 100 picks range, you can really just go for you go upside hunting as much as you want. Rankings don't really matter as much. And then Tate, his ADP is around 130. I'd anticipate that to slightly go up, but maybe not. Kevin Porter Jr. is, on the other hand, this was his ADP before the John Wall news. I have a feeling it's going to skyrocket. In the lead up to the fantasy season, it's quite possible that Kevin Porter Jr. is getting drafted closer to the 80s range. And those numbers that I just showed you on the board, if that would have translated to top 180 value, you're going to have to assume a lot of leaps for KPJ. You're going to have to assume that he's going to have to clean up one of those percentages entirely, that he's going to have to cut down on those turnovers dramatically. Even if you're punting one of those categories or two of those categories, it's going to be really tough to justify taking him at that 80s range where he's going to perhaps start sneaking up to. Again, this was his ADP before the John Wall news. And the secret's going to be out that he's going to be that starting point guard. So a lot to consider there. I think that no matter which way you cut it, they both are going to see an uptick in value. It's just going to be a matter of where you can draft them. I think Tate, he still doesn't have a lot of name recognition. I'm very high on his ability to beat most draft positions this year. Granted, if you're getting him at 130, I think that's a great pick. There's a possibility that guys like Eric Gordon and Daniel House will compete for forward minutes, and maybe he doesn't play 30 per game, but neither of those two players are really a part of the Rockets' future plans. And again, Tate is not like this blue chip prospect. He's going to be turning 26 this season. There's only so much room for him to continue to progress, but he still fits the timeline of what Houston's trying to do better than those two do. He's a better defender than Eric Gordon and Daniel House. And again, if you're a great defender in the NBA, you're going to find the minutes. If you give Sean Tate 30 minutes per game this season, I really like his chances of hitting that top 100 value. But these two, I think it makes a lot of sense for them to replicate a lot, to step into the hole left behind by John Wall. It'll be interesting to see whether or not anyone else can emerge in that unit. Other interesting rookies that could potentially get themselves into the mix over the course of the season. Nothing in Houston's really set in stone outside of Jalen Green and Christian Wood and Kevin Porter Jr. starting and playing big minutes. So, a lot to figure out as we get closer there. But again, I think Kevin Porter Jr. is going to be a worthy point target. It all depends on the type of scoring settings that you're using, but if he is going to be somewhere available in the 70s to 60s range, I think that it's absolutely worth taking him there. But be very careful in category leagues. Be very wary of the 19 points and 7.5 assists. I know it looks sexy, but you can't go and just take him in with your 80th pick when there's value up on the board there. There's just no way that he can hit that range unless he dramatically in 3 of those 9 categories overnight. And that's a really tall task, especially playing a position that he's still just figuring out. On the flip side, in category leagues, I think Sean Tate is going to be a very valuable guy to take after the first 100 picks. Definitely don't take him any higher than that because you're going to kill his value. But he has the potential to be a really high steals guy, help you out with a smattering of rebounds, assists, and high field goal percentage. Very versatile that I think is going to have a strong role on this Rockets team this season, permitted that permitted that a John Wall trade does, if one actually happens and they bring in other guys that could compete for those roles, then we'll have to do a whole new video. That's kind of my take on it. Let me know in the comments if you agree, if you disagree, other guys you might have questions about on this team. And otherwise, just, stay safe drafting out there. Don't reach for any of these guys. Make sure, let them fall to you. Let the course of the draft play out. Don't buy too much into the hype without doing your research first. We'll be back with another video later this Friday and a couple more over the weekend. Once again, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if not, I appreciate you coming in and tuning in regardless. Thanks for watching, everyone. We will catch you